Hello there. This is the 5th entry in my Bioshock Retrospective series. If you'd like to start at the beginning, you can follow the link in the top right corner. Still here? Another disclaimer. This video expects viewers to be knowledgeable not only on the events of Burial at Sea or its base game Bioshock Infinite, but the original Bioshock as well. You've been warned. Expect full spoilers for the entire Bioshock franchise from this point forward. Now that the riffraff has been weeded out, let us begin in earnest. Bioshock Infinite offered players the chance to explore an incredibly fresh new world in the floating city of Columbia. However, for many, the highlight of the game is a brief moment, scant minutes really, spent in the underwater city of Rapture during the game's wild climactic sequence. It cannot be overstated just how integral Rapture is to this series. In some circles, Bioshock Infinite isn't even considered a Bioshock game, simply because it leaves Rapture behind. There's no doubt the developers were acutely aware of the importance Rapture has to this fanbase. The fact that Irrational considered a reunion tour of the previous 2.5 games to be a more exciting surprise for players than a brand new world speaks volumes. Remember that in Infinite's narrative, there are infinite unique worlds that Elizabeth could have jumped to instead. Truly a remarkable coincidence that out of all of these possibilities, we arrive at the sole familiar one. I'm not casting judgment here. I was grinning like an idiot at this reveal just like the rest of you. Regardless of how you feel, we can all agree that Ken Levine and his team understood that a return to Rapture was the most effective method to satisfy fans. With that in mind, Burial at Sea essentially transplanting the characters of Infinite into Rapture shouldn't come as a surprise. That tiny Rapture tease in the base game essentially acts as marketing for Burial at Sea, a brief appetizer before the main course of nostalgia. Approaching from a cynical angle, the DLC's purpose is of course to extract more profit out of players, and the specific method through which Burial at Sea accomplishes this comes down to simple fan service. Obviously, I'm not talking anime-style sexual fan service, although maybe there is a bit of that as well. Instead, I'm referring to intentionally presenting players with familiar faces, locales, and even gameplay mechanics with the goal of inducing that brief shot of dopamine as their brain registers that it both remembers and is fond of the subject in question. Consider that this is far from a lazy direction for Bioshock Infinite's DLC. All the assets and environments needed to be built from scratch in Infinite's engine. Certainly much more work than recycling Columbia for some side story. No, the return to Rapture was a very deliberate direction because it's what the players wanted. Nearly every design decision can be traced back to this crowd-pleasing intention. Surely at this point, Levine knew he was saying farewell to Bioshock. It tracks that he'd aimed to go out with a bang by putting a nice little bow on the series and rewarding players who have been with the franchise since the beginning. Why then has Burial at Sea, what for all intents and purposes should have been an easy slam dunk, completely divided the fanbase? Let's dig in. Burial at Sea is split into 2 episodes that were released 4.5 months apart in the year that followed Infinite's release. They tell one continuous story, but notably differ in many key areas, so I'll follow suit and split this discussion between the 2. Let's begin with Burial at Sea Episode 2. Just kidding. Naturally, we'll start with Episode 1. Despite waking up at the bottom of the ocean, we find ourselves in the shoes of a notably not drowned Booker/Comstock. Already players' minds are inevitably reeling with questions that the game is going to have to satisfactorily answer. With multiverse narratives, this is where the real difficulty lies. It's easy enough to create compelling questions for players, but writing yourself out of those questions is another thing entirely. We'll table that whole can of worms for later, and focus just on the explicit narrative of Episode 1 for now. A femme fatale type woman enters Booker's private investigator office and hires him for a job, locating a child that's gone missing. The woman is a version of Elizabeth, but one almost unrecognizable from the wide-eyed girl that accompanied us in Columbia. It's apparent there is some plot at work. The request is a personal one. Booker knew this child, Sally, but considered her dead, presumably through some neglect on his end. The date is New Year's Eve 1958, a very important day in Rapture's history. Tonight, the Kashmir restaurant bombing will kick off the Rapture Civil War, but for now, we're treated to a delicious taste of Rapture before the fall. The first chunk of the campaign is a walking sim sequence similar to the opening hour of Infinite itself, bereft of combat or much gameplay at all. Opinions may vary about these segments, but I consider them to be a fantastic way to get your feet wet. You could follow the main quest arrow and get to the meat of the game in mere minutes if you really wanted to, but where's the fun in that? I like to take my time, soaking in the impeccable set dressing and stagecraft on display, oohing and ahhing at each little choreographed moment or NPC conversation. The fan favorite Sander Cohen has knowledge on Sally's whereabouts, but we have to get our hands on one of the exclusive rabbit masks to enter his invite-only club. Pilfering the local artisans is as good a reason as any to explore this small slice of Rapture at its peak. Once Booker and Elizabeth come face to face with the coked-out Cohen, he demands the pair indulge him in a dance for his muse. I love the parallels to Elizabeth's jubilant, carefree dance on Battleship Bay. The burden she now carries is clearly evident, and it really puts her transformation into perspective. Shout out to the character animation as always. Bioshock Infinite really excelled in that department, and Burial at Sea is no different. Well, you get what you ask for. Cohen does send us off to Sally, it's just that she lies in the sunken Fontaine department store. Broken off from the rest of Rapture, it's now used as a sort of prison island for Fontaine's followers. As a loyal card-carrying member of the Bioshock 2 fan club, I'd be remiss not to point out that there already exists a prison sector in Persephone. Alas, Bioshock 2 continues to be treated as the black sheep of the series. The department store is overrun with splicers, which predictably means it's time to talk combat. A shocking amount of effort was taken in shifting Bioshock Infinite's gunplay to better resemble combat in the Rapture games. The weapons are fundamentally unchanged, but Irrational has adjusted ammo supply and damage numbers to create a feeling of scarcity and vulnerability that was never present in Infinite's campaign. Similar to a really good fan mod, you can definitely feel that these mechanics are being somewhat awkwardly adapted away from their original intent, like forcing a square peg into a round hole. Nevertheless, the extent to which game feel can be transformed just through number tweaking is impressive. The new system is very functional, if a bit inelegant. With these changes in effect, intelligent and conservative approaches are essential. Storming in guns blazing is punished heavily. To facilitate this deliberately scarce ammo supply, Burial at Sea miraculously removes the 2-gun limit. The inability to cycle through your whole arsenal at will was one of the most egregious regressions Infinite made from the franchise's formula, so it's wonderful to see the developers listening to fan feedback. Funny anecdote, on my first DLC playthrough I had the game hint system turned off from my most recent replay of the main game. I'm sure I'm not alone in completely missing the weapon wheel explanation for this reason. It wasn't until I accidentally held the E key down, much later on, that I discovered how the system works. I don't really have grounds to complain because I did have hints disabled, but the system would be a lot more intuitive if you could just scroll through weapons with the mouse wheel, instead of having to pause the action and bring up a menu. This is such an obvious quality of life feature that its absence implies there is some technical quirk with how Infinite is programmed that mandates the weapon wheel. Whatever, I'm just glad the 2-weapon limit has been scrapped. Even with all of your weapons accessible, you won't get far relying solely on gunpowder. Choice figures from Infinite return: Possession, Devil's Kiss, Shock Jockey, and Bucking Bronco. All are essentially unchanged, but they are now conveniently referred to as plasmids rather than vigors. I'm pretty reasonable and don't necessarily expect new plasmid injection animations, but don't gaslight me by acting like drinkable plasmids have always existed in Rapture. At the end of the day, it's inoffensive compared to the grievances to come, but I do find it a bit cringe-inducing to watch the writers twist themselves into knots, attempting to explain this new form of plasmid. Shoddy retcons aren't all that's new. The radar range weapon and Old Man Winter plasmid round out our combat options. Old Man Winter is almost indistinguishable from Bioshock's Winter Blast, and is used as a progression block more than anything, so I don't really have much to add. The radar range weapon is quite satisfying in how effortlessly it cooks splicers, but ammo is far too scarce to get much use out of it. For that reason alone, it does very little to meaningfully add to the combat experience. You'll only be able to use it for a fight or two throughout the entire campaign. That campaign is over before you know it. Even without rushing, the average player is unlikely to get much more than 2 hours of playtime before rolling credits on Episode 1. I aim to critique games as art rather than as a commercial product, so I'll hold my tongue on how the cost per hour value metric breaks down. It's a moot point anyway, now that the entire franchise collection can be had for like $10 total these days. Instead, I just have to question the reasoning behind including progression elements in an experience that will in all likelihood be completed in a single sitting. I voiced similar frustrations about Bioshock 2's Minerva's Den campaign, but it's even worse here. Recall that a large chunk, maybe a third, of the experience is purely storytelling without any combat at all. When you also consider that nothing from Episode 1 carries over to Episode 2, did we really need a whole plasmid upgrade system? The plasmids and weapons are handed out so rapidly as is, I barely had time to give each option a try before getting the next one. Before I knew it, the game was over and I had never even used half the tools given to me. The gear and infusion systems from Infinite are recycled over to Rapture 2, which is utterly baffling. They serve absolutely zero purpose in a title this short, and only add clutter. You can literally count the number of infusion opportunities on one hand. Even with all 4 focused in one direction, health, shields, or Eve, you'd be hard-pressed to feel the difference. The gear is even more ridiculous. I don't even have time to use all the weapons. You think I have time to craft a specific build? After making our way to the housewares section, we find Sally hiding within the Little Sister vent network. Elizabeth and Booker lock up all but one of the vent exits, before Elizabeth pushes Booker to turn up the heat in an effort to flush the girl out. A struggling Sally, revealed to be a little sister, calls upon a Big Daddy protector, and we arrive at the moment everyone's been waiting for. Big Daddy fights are inherently awesome, and this daddy has some new tricks up his sleeve with a retractable grapple drill. Experientially, it can feel jarring and disorienting to be reeled in from a first-person perspective, but this is still undeniably cool. While I'm not sold on the introduction of pneumo lines within Rapture from a continuity perspective, they do add a dynamic new flavor to this encounter. Allowing players to summon an Iron Patriot is the cherry on top. Smashing these 2 iconic bosses together and making them fight each other just fills me with childlike delight. The numerous tears and ample space prevent the fight from being too challenging, but it's one I like to replay and a great cap to Episode 1's gameplay portion. What follows is a brief story sequence. We've been playing as a Comstock who accidentally killed his stolen Elizabeth and sought escape from his guilt in Rapture. Now you may disagree, but I personally get the impression our Booker Comstock is remorseful for his actions. The way he cared for Sally and reacts to this revelation feels genuine. This makes it all the more shocking when Elizabeth just watches him get eviscerated by the revived Big Daddy, without so much as lifting a finger to help. To recap, Elizabeth somehow shows up uninvited in Rapture to drag a repentant man out of the small life he's managed to build for himself, force him to relive his past trauma, lead him to his death, and then relish in his violent demise. Not to mention, burn a child alive along the way. What happened since we last saw her? She comes across as an ice-cold killer. Elizabeth certainly grew during the course of Bioshock Infinite, and did take a darker turn by the end, but she is downright unrecognizable here. The way she plots out this whole sequence out of nothing more than her own personal desire for revenge is legitimately psychopath behavior. In Infinite, Elizabeth did what she felt was necessary to end the cycle, but she certainly took no pleasure in it. And by the way, what happened to ending that cycle? Elizabeth's actions at the end of Infinite, namely drowning Booker at his baptism, served to eliminate all Comstocks across all realities. With no Comstock, there can be no Columbia, and thus no Elizabeth. And yet here we are, playing as a Comstock, accompanied by an Elizabeth. This whole idea of ending the cycle isn't like some fan interpretation. It's spelled out directly in the text. You might be able to convince me that Elizabeth's elevated powers somehow allowed her to continue existing after drowning Booker Comstock, but that does nothing at all to explain how Comstock himself could possibly exist. What's worse, this is stated to be the final Comstock, which is fundamentally at odds with multiverse rules. There can either be infinite Comstocks or none at all. There is no in between. The ending of Bioshock Infinite managed to instill a surprisingly satisfying sense of finality to an unwieldy multiverse narrative, only for Burial at Sea Episode 1 to crudely rip it open again. And for what? The answers of course lie in Episode 2. We open with yet another walking simulator section, this time within Elizabeth's subconscious. And once again, I applaud the care and artistry on display. In a time of extreme stress, Elizabeth reverted to this childish, idealized version of the world as a coping mechanism. The entirety of her knowledge on Paris was pulled from the books in her tower, so Elizabeth's Paris is like a painting come to life, where everyone is her best friend, and the kids really love bread. Experiencing the version of Paris that Liz pined for during her many years of imprisonment brings us full circle back to her first introduction, and offers players an insightful look into her psyche. Good stuff. It doesn't take long for the illusion to shatter as this dream morphs into a nightmare. Seems Elizabeth does actually feel guilt over her callous treatment of Sally in episode 1 after all. The plot demands it, so of course that's the case. I'm assuming that players are supposed to think that she was so single-minded in her quest for revenge that she hadn't considered the resulting collateral damage on the innocent. Questionable choice to have an omniscient supernatural being fail to comprehend the grade school lesson that actions have consequences. And that's not all. Elizabeth could see through all the doors, but didn't foresee her demise at the hands of the same Big Daddy she sicked on Booker Comstock. For some convoluted reason, Elizabeth is then revived as a mere mortal without any of her powers over tears. I understand the intent was to lower Elizabeth's power level to fit within the boundaries of game design, but there's an awful lot of hand-waving going on here. I highly doubt the writer's room could even explain all of this, so I'm certainly not going to try. During Burial at Sea episode 2, we play as Elizabeth accompanied by Booker, despite both having died immediately prior. The Bioshock series has officially jumped the shark, but I'll try my best to suspend disbelief. Booker, now some fragment of Elizabeth's imagination, guides her through a negotiation with Atlas to save her and Sally's lives. Our end of the deal is to secure a means for Atlas and his men to return to Rapture, and another familiar face in Suchong may have the solution. Once the gameplay portion of Burial at Sea episode 2 begins, it immediately becomes apparent the game plays unlike any previous Bioshock. Elizabeth is incredibly frail, even compared to episode 1, and must rely on stealth to dispatch enemies and traverse the environment. Stealth has long been a foundational element in immersive sims, with games like Thief and Dishonored, but has never been a major component of the Bioshock series until now. The return of the classic healing system, with a maximum capacity of 5 first aid kits, helps to alleviate the punishing damage enemies will inflict if Liz gets caught in a face-to-face skirmish. I was already impressed with how far the core of Bioshock Infinite was transformed for episode 1, and now episode 2 goes even further into completely uncharted territory. I applaud this bold choice, and while it certainly could use some fine-tuning, it works better than you'd expect. A smattering of Booker's weapons and plasmids are recycled here again, but it's the new additions that I want to highlight. Stealth-focused tools like the crossbow and the Peeping Tom plasmid make it entirely possible to complete the whole game without killing a single enemy. This isn't quite the same as the Bioshock 1 crossbow, but it's similarly powerful with 3 different ammo types to cover every situation. The primary tranquilizer bolt is a fantastic long-range option to neutralize a single target without announcing your presence to other nearby splicers. The noisemaker bolt is a tactical tool that attracts enemies to its location, useful for clearing a path for yourself or for grouping up enemies for the gas bolt. This final ammo type releases a tranquilizing gas that will knock out any splicer in the generous affected area. These bolts are all treated as a separate weapon in the weapon wheel, which is needlessly clunky, but together they inarguably form the most powerful weapon in our kit. Ammo is somewhat recyclable too, by looting unconscious enemies, meaning there is even less reason to use the nerfed, more traditional guns. Peeping Tom is similarly multifaceted. A quick tap will reveal enemies and objects of interest through walls, and holding the input will temporarily render Elizabeth invisible. Whether you're using it to map out a safe route through a maze of splicers, or to make a desperate escape when that route didn't prove as safe as expected, Peeping Tom is an indispensable plasmid that almost single-handedly enables this new stealth focus. Because I insist on ruining the fun for myself, I quickly realized how exploitable invisibility is. An upgrade enables infinite invisibility, as long as Elizabeth remains stationary, which removes any challenge the game would otherwise offer. Unaware foes can be one-shot with a simple melee attack, and these enemies immediately forget about Elizabeth once she disappears, so you can just dispatch splicers right in front of their backup with no repercussion. Rinse and repeat until all threats are neutralized. It's truly game-breaking, in a similar way Return to Sender was in the base game, but as long as you exercise some self-control, we'll just call it a minor balance issue. Speaking of that cursed vigor, we've also got Ironsides, a close cousin of Return to Sender that converts incoming damage to usable ammo, and thankfully consumes mana much faster than its problematic counterpart. Despite the odd infinite leftovers, Rapture is recreated remarkably well throughout both episodes. The more expansive combat arenas are the only areas where I feel like I'm traversing a Rapture imitation rather than Rapture itself. These open areas are the exception rather than the rule, thankfully, so I consider Rapture the Setting's return a roaring success. The majority of playtime is spent skulking through claustrophobic corridors, searching for resources, and praying there isn't a splicer around the corner. Burial at Sea's explorable area is actually quite small when you map it out, but the increased density and slower pace of combat makes it feel substantial enough. The level design largely returns to a focus on exploration with some degree of non-linearity. These aren't just straight paths you'll run through once and quickly forget about, but crisscrossed, interconnected paths that you'll slowly uncover inch by inch as you gradually form a mental map of each zone. Bioshocks 1 and 2 exemplified strong environmental storytelling, and Burial at Sea does an admirable job at recreating the distinct feel of Rapture's propaganda, advertisements, and other world-building elements. My favorite example is the Ryan the Lion Preparatory Academy, where Rapture's objectivist ideology is packaged up in kid-friendly messaging, delivered by mascots Ryan the Lion and Peter the Parasite. There's so many neat little details that paint a picture of what a typical day in the school would be like. The importance of winning in playground games is emphasized above all else, and being caught sharing toys is grounds for the corner of shame. I couldn't hold back my laughter when I saw the lunchroom menu. This whole school setting might have been added just so this no free lunch joke could be used. It's so good. In Suchong's clinic, the full extent of his collaboration with Jeremiah Fink is revealed. The two cities are linked through a tear. Elizabeth realizes that the same Lutece particle that allows Columbia to float could be used to raise Atlas's army to Rapture proper, thus satisfying her end of their deal. What follows is a pretty underwhelming return to Columbia. The level design is half new and half recycled, but even what's new doesn't really move the needle. When I said Burial at Sea was much more ambitious than the typical scope of a DLC, this is what I was comparing it to: a simple rehashed adventure in Columbia. Not to beat a dead horse, but remind me again how Columbia continues to exist after the events of Infinite. I have much less to discuss regarding our stay in Columbia than our time in Rapture, but two big things stand out to me. The first is the unnecessary recontextualization of Daisy Fitzroy's character motivation. The game clunkily railroads you into witnessing the conversation between Fitzroy and the Luteces, where it's revealed that she never meant to kill Fink's son at all. The plan was to merely threaten violence and cause Elizabeth to step up and grow into the woman who could kill Comstock. Elizabeth's first kill already functioned as that important step on her journey. Nothing is added with the forced addition of this background scheme to push her in that direction. On the contrary, I'd actually argue a lot is lost with its inclusion. Daisy loses all agency, and Elizabeth's growth comes across as artificial. If I had to guess, this Daisy retcon was driven by backlash from a vocal minority. Some sensitive players might view the original scene in a racist light, due to Daisy's skin color. I personally never saw it that way, and I definitely don't see how relegating Daisy to a pawn in a Lutece experiment makes the perception any better. My other issue with the Columbia segment may come across hypocritical, but it's my honest thoughts. I typically roll my eyes at prequels' tendencies to over-explain every plot element until there is no room for theorizing. That being said, I was really excited initially when it seemed Episode 2 was about to outline the origins of Songbird. We do get some surface-level details on how the technology was copied from the Big Daddies, and how Elizabeth and Songbird first bonded, but the game never provides answers to the question that's been burning in my head since I first played Infinite. Who is Songbird? With how intricately crafted Infinite's plot is, and how integral Songbird is to that narrative, I find it exceedingly hard to believe that his identity is totally incidental. Is he really just a dragon guarding Elizabeth's tower, with no greater significance than that? Comstock would just pick a random Colombian to undergo this procedure and perform such an incredibly important task? Even if that is the case, is it too much to ask for an audio log or two from this mystery man's perspective? For all its infinite realities, Songbird's identity is one of the biggest gaps in Infinite's story, and I'm genuinely dismayed that Burial at Sea proves Irrational really never had any larger plans for this untapped thread. Upon returning to Rapture with our end of the bargain fulfilled, Atlas reneges on releasing Sally and instead sets to torturing Elizabeth for information on some ace in the hole. Throughout this whole retrospective series, I've continually praised Bioshock's first-person animation, and the lobotomy scene is a new high point for me. It's impossible to sit through this without squirming in your seat at least a little. Hopefully this incredibly effective sequence suitably prepares Bioshock fans for the torture they are about to go through, as Elizabeth retrieves this ace in the hole, and Barry Let's See's story reaches its climax. The ace is, of course, the trigger phrase, "Would you kindly?" One last compliment before I tear into the implications of this plot twist. I really love the framing during this slow walk back to Fontaine, with the destruction of Rapture in the background. Gorgeous cinematography, or whatever you call it for video games. Alright, now the gloves are coming off. All jokes aside, I don't particularly enjoy being negative in these retrospective videos, but I'm always going to voice my honest thoughts, and often those are critical. When you first played the original Bioshock in 2007, were you picturing a superpowered Mary Sue running around behind the scenes, setting all the wheels in motion? Oh, you weren't? Guess you just didn't have the full picture at the time, but don't you feel so much more enlightened now that you do? The implications of Barry Let's See trace the lion's share of Bioshock's most pivotal moments back to Elizabeth. She incited the Rapture Civil War. She effectively delivered Jack to Rapture and Fontaine. She created the protector bond between Big Daddy and Little Sister. It's honestly surprising that the writers demonstrated any level of restraint at all. I mean, wouldn't the story be so much better if she inceptioned the idea for Rapture into Andrew Ryan's mind too? Ken Levine frequently refers to the character of Elizabeth as like a daughter to him. It's understandable he's grown attached to her after enduring Infinite's torture development. But in Barry Let's See, she's treated like a black hole, with the entirety of Bioshock revolving around her getting sucked into her story. Somehow, the introduction of a dimension-hopping demigod ends up making Bioshock's universe feel smaller. The frankly insane amount of retconning obviously contradicts established lore in the original games and supplementary media like the Rapture novel. It's not ideal, but I wouldn't get this agitated over little details here and there. That's not what I'm on about at all. Bioshock was widely considered one of the greatest stories this medium had ever produced, yet here it's just paraded around as a cheap party trick with no reverence. Implied parallels between Rapture and Columbia are fascinating, and I admittedly did enjoy some of the peeks behind the curtain Barry Let's See afforded. Things like seeing the other side of Su Chong's death scene, or uncovering Fontaine's hideout complete with his Chinaman disguise. But I draw the line at fundamentally changing the entire foundation of the original game's classic story. Levine is obviously within his rights to tell his story the way he wishes, but I don't understand how he thought it could possibly be well received by the fanbase. As we established, Barry Let's See was obviously intended to be a love letter to the Bioshock fanbase. Nowhere in the infinite multiverse would those fans appreciate the manner in which Bioshock's story is defiled here. You're entitled to your own opinion, of course, but the way I see it, this Elizabeth-centric universe model only works if you have just enough knowledge of Bioshock for the reveals to have significance, but not enough understanding to realize how patently ridiculous it all is. For the vast majority of players, it's gonna fall flat, if not come across as outright offensive. Barry Let's See tarnishes the original Bioshock's legacy by recontextualizing its entire narrative as a mere footnote in Elizabeth's story. On the other hand, by reopening a closed loop, Barry Let's See spits on Infinite's masterful ending and renders it ultimately meaningless. After sullying 2/3 of the Bioshock trilogy, stay strong out there, Bio 2, is it too much to ask for Barry Let's See to at least tell a coherent story on its own? Apparently, because the 2 episodes fail even that. The themes of vengeance and redemption are muddled when the protagonist jumps between extremes whenever the plot demands it. Elizabeth as a cold-blooded killer is painfully forced, and her sudden turn to sacrificial messiah is never earned. It's clear the writers were making up Barry Let's See's story as they went. I straight up refuse to believe that Elizabeth also dying by Big Daddy was the original vision for Episode 1's cliffhanger ending. I can forgive contradiction with the lore established in a novel of questionable canonical status, but contradicting your own story? Elizabeth supposedly is responsible for the creation of the protector bond in Episode 2. Are we just supposed to forget that she was killed by a clearly bonded Big Daddy earlier in the same game? Furthermore, Barry Let's See's ending is profoundly hollow and unsatisfying. What exactly does saving Sally accomplish? Does preserving the life of one little sister really justify all the lives that will be lost in the civil war that Elizabeth essentially ignited? What's to stop Sally from being harvested by the next thirsty splicer that she encounters? She could even be harvested by the very man whose arrival Elizabeth celebrates. Despite what the game says, Jack was no saint during the events of Bioshock 1. You don't just get to dramatically fade to black and expect us all to cheer. Have some respect for the player and earn that dramatic fade. The specific tale Burial at Sea attempts to tell single-handedly ruins the game as a whole. There are a few bright patches I could point to, but when you look at the bigger picture, the story is an unmitigated disaster. It's such a shame, too. In returning to Rapture, Burial at Sea needed to do justice to the setting, the gameplay, and the story of the original Bioshock. Rapture is wonderfully realized, and I jumped at the chance to explore my beloved city in a fresh new light. In addition, the devs went above and beyond in their efforts to recreate the classic combat system and gameplay loop. They nailed 2 out of the 3, but the sheer amount of disrespect demonstrated towards the story threatens to invalidate the victories on the other 2 fronts completely. At the most surface level, Burial at Sea is still fun to play, and I can enjoy it on that base front. But shouldn't we expect more from the climax of such a legendary storytelling franchise? Once again, I do want to apologize for the negativity surrounding Burial at Sea. In the past, I've managed to compartmentalize the story in a little corner of my brain where it won't interfere with my enjoyment of the rest of the franchise. But with this video, I had to finally face it head on, and it got a bit ugly, didn't it? As one of my all-time favorite video game franchises, I of course would prefer to end this retrospective series on a more positive note. At least for the time being, this is my last Bioshock video. It feels great to finally say I've officially covered the entire series on this channel. If and when Cloud Chamber ever ships their nebulous Bioshock product, I'll of course cover it, but I'm not holding my breath at this point. At the moment, I'm far more hyped for Ken Levine's upcoming spiritual successor, Judas, anyway. Special shout out of course to my patrons, Axel Dieker, Sarah Marguerite, and Andreas Schouten, but a heartfelt thank you to all of you out there. Whether you've been with me since my first Bioshock video, or just hopped in with this entry, I sincerely appreciate you joining me on this journey, and I hope it's been both insightful and entertaining. Please don't hesitate to leave your thoughts in the comments. Whether we agree or disagree, I'd still love to hear from you. With all that being said, until next time, and please take care.